nobody's surprise, Red Dead Redemption 2 broke sales records and even surpassed the lofty expectations of publisher Take-Two. In just a couple of days, the game made more money than most others can hope to make in a lifetime. Rockstar's Golden Goose brought in $725 million in 3 days and sold 17 million copies in 2 weeks. Record numbers only bested by, you guessed it, the most successful entertainment product in human history, GTA 5. As is a tradition with Rockstar titles, Red Dead Redemption 2's staggering commercial acclaim was accompanied by equally as impressive critical praise. According to critics, Red Dead can do no wrong, reflected by the godly Metacritic score of 97%, making it the highest rated game on PS4 and Xbox One. In light of such universal admiration, it should be of little surprise that mainstream gaming media have titled Red Dead Redemption 2 the best game of the generation, and in some instances even more, the best open world game of all time. While I cannot deny that Rockstar's Wild West adventure does certain things exceptionally well, and maybe even better than all the games which came before, it also seems like many of these euphoric reviews leave out a vital piece of information. As soon as we divert our attention from the stunning visuals, meticulous world design and remarkably crafted characters, Red Dead Redemption 2 has a hard time justifying its reputation as one of gaming's greatest masterpieces. In the end, gameplay is where the rubber meets the road. Unfortunately, Red Dead Redemption 2's gameplay never reaches the quality standards of its surrounding elements. Instead, it represents the game's most obvious weak spot. As far as I'm concerned, there is not nearly enough conversation regarding the game's flaws. Because so many of Red Dead 2's individual parts are pushing the envelope of the video game medium to great success, the game's failings become all the more apparent. As many of you know, I placed Red Dead 2 on the second spot in my personal Game of the Year list, behind God of War. To be honest, even now I am baffled by this decision. The first Red Dead Redemption belongs to my all-time favorite games, and since its release 8 years ago I was eagerly awaiting to return to the Wild West and John Marston. This should have been an easy win for Red Dead Redemption 2. It should have been my undisputed Game of the Year. Yet I could not bring myself to do so, despite my emotional attachment to the first Red Dead and all the outstanding qualities of its successor. The longer I dwell on my experience with Red Dead 2, the more I realize that I left the sequel to one of my favorite games disappointed. The best way to describe my stance on Red Dead 2 is to say, it's one of the best disappointing games I've ever played. As harsh as it may sound, but I'm not sure if I want to return to Red Dead 2 anytime soon. It's quite unusual to play a game that is so masterfully crafted in some aspects and so unbelievably outdated and broken in others. Allow me to explain why Red Dead 2's gameplay component ultimately left me dissatisfied and why the game's mechanical shortcomings are far more than minor flaws. Don't take this to mean I hate the game. It didn't end up so high in my Game of the Year list for no reason. All things considered, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a phenomenal open world experience. What I'm objecting to is the overinflated Metacritic score and the downplaying of Red Dead's severely flawed gameplay. Calling it a masterpiece overall means to neglect painfully obvious weak points that account for a huge portion of the game. The bottom line is, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a great game, but not to the degree mainstream gaming media wants you to believe. Here's my rather critical take on Red Dead Redemption 2, a once-in-a-generation game. What could possibly go wrong? Let me preface the critical part of this video by acknowledging the game's most noteworthy achievements. My attempt to extend an olive branch, if you will. But I will do my best to keep it short, since the vast majority of reviews already discussed the game's strong points at length. Red Dead Redemption 2's greatest qualities boil down to three aspects in particular. Above all else, the game excels at presenting 1. Top-notch graphics and animation work, 2. An authentic, cohesive world rich in detail, and 3. A gripping story full of greatly written characters. Regarding the first point, you really don't have to be a graphics expert to get to the conclusion that Red Dead 2 is pushing technological boundaries and delivers the very best of graphical fidelity on all possible fronts. Whether it's the impressive draw distance of the world at large, or the microscopic detail you can find in each individual puddle on muddy streets, Red Dead 2 maintains an insanely high quality bar. There is a detailed animation for every possible scenario, from realistic facial expressions to leaves blowing in the wind, all the way to shitting horses. Much like the first Red Dead, the successor benefits from a dynamic weather system that makes each day unique. Even after playing the game for nearly 100 hours, no sunset or cloud formation looks the same. The weather system is definitely up there with the best in recent memory, like Witcher 3 and Horizon Zero Dawn. The transition between different weather patterns or times of day can be a little too abrupt. At times it looks like someone is turning on a light switch, but this may be nothing more than the result of a strongly condensed day and night cycle. And if this weren't impressive enough, the frame rate is rock solid despite the demanding graphics and physics calculations. Red Dead Redemption 2 looks and runs like an exclusive on all platforms. Regardless which system you choose, Red Dead 2 is a graphical powerhouse and the very best this generation of hardware has to offer. But graphics alone don't sell the believability of a world. Red Dead 2's most advanced and fleshed out elements are the inner coherence and liveliness of the world around you. Like many open world games before, Red Dead Redemption 2 faced the daunting task of creating a place that feels alive and believable. Rockstar had to find a way to bring the gorgeous and breathtaking, yet also unforgiving and dangerous landscape of the American heartland to life. Like we already discussed, one way Red Dead 2 is trying to achieve this goal is by creating a game world based on state-of-the-art graphics. While pretty graphics certainly don't hurt, on their own they are not sufficient enough to make the world feel alive. An open world that looks graphically stunning, full of high-quality textures, god rays, weather effects, and fancy animations can still end up being superficial, shallow, and lifeless. Take Sea of Thieves as a case in point. By and large, it was a tech demo whose world featured as a backdrop for pretty water simulations, instead of filling it with life, not to mention meaningful content in general. A far more effective way to immerse players in a game world is to create an intricate virtual ecosystem that behaves to its own rules. Whereas the oceans and islands of Sea of Thieves are empty and dead, the forests, swamps and mountains of Red Dead 2 are full of animals and interesting encounters. The wildlife not only interacts with the player by either running away or attacking, the 200 different animal species even interact among themselves, regardless of player influence. The sheer amount of behavior patterns is astounding. To name just a few, horses get anxious whenever a potential predator is nearby or bolt when you are too close. Bears and wolves compete for prey, animals are attracted by the smell of a dead body and feast on the corpse, eagles grab fish right out of rivers, and I found a video in which the antlers of two deer are tangled up and one of them is trying to break free. Even village pets display remarkably complex behavior that most players are never gonna notice, given how rare and subtle it is. For instance, petting dogs causes them to greet you with excitement whenever you return to town. You can find entire Reddit threads dedicated to seeking out Reddit's impressively detailed animal behavior. One player saw a dog waiting at his owner's grave, and another one was able to observe a cat casually sharpening its claws on a wooden post. I'm sure you can find dozens of similar examples by observing the game's many different animal species. Rockstar's virtual imitation of a complex ecosystem sells the perfect illusion of an autonomous world that continues to exist even if you aren't looking. I can't applaud Rockstar enough for their efforts. I hope more and more open world games will follow Red Dead's example, since a believable ecosystem is a great way to enhance player immersion. Horizon Zero Dawn featured similar efforts, and especially Monster Hunter World, as a game that's all about the hunting of creatures in their natural habitats, showcases the great benefits of a rich and detailed ecosystem. Graphics and world building aside, one of the most intriguing questions going into Red Dead Redemption 2 was how the writers would handle the story. After all, the story of the first Red Dead is widely regarded as one of the best video game narratives. Unlike the GTA franchise, which features a high dose of over-the-top action and highly satirized characters, Red Dead Redemption's narrative embraces a significantly slower pace and characters more in line with the grounded historical setting they are placed in. Don't take this to mean Red Dead 2 is free of Rockstar's well-known proclivity for dark humor. There's still plenty to chuckle about. But all in all, the demise of Dutch van der Linde's gang belongs to the most serious and grounded stories the developer has ever told. Maybe I should start by stating the obvious. If the acting and dialogue writing of Red Dead 2 doesn't represent the absolute best video games are currently capable of, then I don't know what does. From the main cast of characters to the smallest NPC encounter, the voice acting is always on point. Developers like Naughty Dog and Santa Monica managed to achieve equally as impressive results, but their games are linear action adventures. Red Dead 2 delivers the same standards on a massive open-world scale. I guess it is yet another side effect of handing a world-class studio like Rockstar unlimited amounts of money and time.
But I'm seeing things a lot more clearly now. I wish things were different. But it weren't us who changed.
Taking place 12 years before the events of the first game at the turn of the century, Red Dead 2's historical backdrop is pretty much identical to its predecessor. Arthur Morgan and the rest of the gang are on the run and struggle to find a place in a world that has changed beyond recognition, no longer supporting the rapidly vanishing lifestyle they are used to. A lifestyle shaped by legendary gunslingers, notorious bands of outlaws, vigilante justice, and the untamed American frontier. The spirit of the Wild West is about to fall into oblivion, made obsolete by industrialization and the social changes it entails. In a way, the van der Linde gang has more in common with the last remaining native tribes than anyone else.
Okay, there she is. A real city. The future.
Big cities. They're...
Always repellent.
Exactly.
The main story alone is over 40 hours long, making it nearly impossible to cover each of the 6 chapters in this video, or 8 chapters if you count the 2-part epilogue. But there are a couple of things that have to be addressed before we move on to the gameplay section. A common complaint in regards to Red Dead's story structure is the slow pacing of the first 2 chapters in particular. One could make the argument it takes until the end of the 3rd chapter until the story starts to pick up steam. While I am inclined to agree that the first few chapters are exposition heavy and slow paced, I'm not sure how a story and world of this magnitude could have been introduced otherwise. The slow pace of the first 2 chapters seems like a necessity in order to get acquainted with the game's numerous gameplay mechanics and systems, and introduce each of the 23 gang members, not even including the dozens of side characters. From the get-go, the narrative has to juggle between insane amounts of characters. A content-heavy game such as Red Dead 2 probably needs a slow start. The player has to know how to hunt and fish, craft tonics, cook meals, tame horses, sell and buy items, rob trains and stagecoaches, collect bounties, purchase horse and weapon upgrades, participate in mini-games such as poker, blackjack and dominoes. The list of side activities goes on. Not to mention that Red Dead Redemption owes a huge part of its appeal to the beautiful environments you are supposed to explore and get lost in. So the deliberately slow-paced beginning makes perfect sense. What definitely deserves a fair amount of criticism is the lazy and overwhelming tutorial section. Rockstar has never been particularly good at well-crafted tutorials, and Red Dead 2's might be the worst one I've seen from Rockstar in a long while. Dumping important information in tiny black boxes in the upper left corner every 10 seconds, while the player is busy shooting enemies or paying attention to the events on screen, is distracting to say the least. It isn't a deal breaker, but it's hard not to perceive the tutorial as an afterthought. The game saves all important tutorial tips in a compendium, however, plenty of open world games have found more elegant ways to convey important information to the player. As I already mentioned, the writers brought themselves in a challenging position by crafting the story around an entire gang of outlaws. In that regard, the first Red Dead had it a lot easier. At the start, the narrative zeroed in on one character and introduced the supporting cast step by step, whereas Red Dead 2 starts off with a massive group of new faces, especially for players who didn't play the original. Stories revolving around an ensemble cast are difficult to pull off across all media. Usually, ensemble casts still got a main protagonist the audience is meant to focus on, but in a best case scenario, you are supposed to develop an emotional bond with all of them. You may have your personal favorites, but you should be able to keep the characters apart and ascribe unique characteristics to each individual. This is easier said than done. Many movies already fail to create characters you can tell apart from one another. However, Red Dead Redemption 2 has the distinctive advantage of being a video game. The cast may be extensive, but so is the nature of open world games. You have dozens, if not hundreds of hours to flesh out your characters. Whether the game succeeds in doing so is a question you'll have to answer for yourself. For the most part, I'd say the writers achieved their goal. Characters like Lenny or Hosea received enough time to make me care about their well-being. Drinking yourself to insanity in Valentine's Bar wasn't just funny as hell, it also made Lenny really likable and his sudden death all the more painful. That being said, not all characters received the same amount of attention. I didn't learn a whole lot more about Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela, for instance. And other characters like Sadie Adler are a little over the top as far as I'm concerned. All her scenes are memorable and I couldn't help but admire the incredibly scuffed voice. At the same time, the believability of the character suffered from over-exaggeration. Red Dead 1 has its fair share of tough and feisty women, but characters like Abigail Marston and Bonnie McFarlane are still grounded enough to remain believable. They can pull their weight and hold their own in a dangerous situation, but unlike Sadie, they aren't unstoppable killing machines. The first time we encounter her, she is barely capable to keep Micah at distance, and a few chapters later she's taking on entire armies. But her relationship with Arthur was one of my personal highlights, because their interactions could be both hilarious and heart-wrenching at once.
Aside from my Jake, you're the best man I've known.
I know the company you keep. The competition ain't too fierce.
When Rockstar revealed that Red Dead Redemption 2 would follow Dutch van der Linde and his famous gang of outlaws, one of my first hopes for the characters and story was a healthy dose of moral ambiguity. The narrative had to strike a balance between the loyalty and companionship amongst the group and the reckless and morally reprehensible deeds they commit. A point that Red Dead 2 absolutely nails is the depiction of the van der Linde gang as a dysfunctional family. They may have their grievances and sometimes they outright hate each other, but when the shit hits the fan, they usually stick together.
You know, nothing means more to me than this gang, the bond we share. It's the most real thing to me. I would kill for it, I would happily die for it. But in spite of all of that, I would have easily left you here to rot if Charles hadn't stopped me.
I don't believe a word of that, Arthur.
Get him out of here.
Lenny and Charles, as well as the women in camp, are treated like everyone else. On the one hand, traditional gender roles and racism don't have a place in the van der Linde gang, so in that regard, this band of misfits is actually more progressive than the civilized world they are battling against. On the other hand, they are not hesitant to threaten and murder people that stand in their way or fail to pay their debts. This stark contrast is especially evident during the climactic end of Chapter 3. When Jack is abducted by the Braithwaite woman, we see the full force of the gang ride out without a second thought. One of their own is in danger, so they stick together. At the same time, they don't care about the mayhem and destruction they commit along the way. While they are capable of ruthless acts of violence, like dragging a frail old woman down the stairs, killing her sons, burning people alive, and destroying her entire estate, they can also appear like a big, wholesome family when they gather around the campfire to celebrate Jack's return.
Un par de ojitos negros, cielito lindo de contrabando. De la sierra morena, cielito lindo, vienen bajando. Un par de ojitos negros, cielito lindo de contrabando. Ay, 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 canta y no llores, porque cantando se alegra.
The moral code and lifestyle of the van der Linde gang have light and dark sides to it, and the writers made sure to point both of them out. Of course, the solidarity of the group starts to crumble once Dutch begins to lose his mind. Dutch's moral degradation and the slowly growing conflict between him and Arthur are easily the most developed and intriguing part of the story. As convincing as Arthur's character arc is portrayed, Rockstar's implementation of player choice sometimes outright contradicts the narrative we are being told. In fact, the final decision the game wants you to make as Arthur makes no goddamn sense in the grand scheme of the story. During Red Dead Redemption 2, the player gets the opportunity to influence the decision-making of Arthur, which is a great deviation from Red Dead 1 where the main story is set in stone. For the most part, player choice in Red Dead 2 works perfectly fine. The decisions you make along the way have a minor influence on the story and Arthur as a character. Some decisions only affect your honor meter a little bit, others let you decide whether you want to deepen your relationship with certain characters. These small moments of player choice never contradict the overall narrative thrust of the story. The same cannot be said about the last decision. Arthur can either help John escape or return to the caves to steal Dutch's money. Depending on which decision you make and the state of your honor meter at this point, Arthur's journey can end in 3 different ways. If you choose to leave John and get the money, Micah kills him in a brutal knife fight during Arthur's selfish attempt to make his escape with Dutch's money. If you choose to help John, Arthur says a last farewell to his brother, allowing him to reunite with his family by holding off as many Pinkertons as he can. If you enter this scene with a low honor level, Micah shoots Arthur in the head. A high honor level will cause Dutch to intervene and leave both of them behind as Arthur dies watching the sunrise. The problem about these 3 possible endings is that only the 2 cliffside endings make sense, while the choice to abandon John shouldn't be a choice at all given the story the game is trying to tell. Going back for the money is nonsensical and directly contradicts Arthur's character development. Leading up to this moment, Arthur experienced the moral decay of Dutch firsthand. At this point, Arthur has accepted the fact that Dutch has lost his mind. Dutch's reckless and disturbing behavior has led to several failed bank robberies, the death of Hosea and Lenny, a bloody war between natives and army troops, and shooting an entire town to hell only to get revenge on Leviticus Cornwall. Not to mention that Dutch left Arthur to die only to lie to his face moments later.
You ran away?
Oh, I did no such thing. Don't be a fool. They could be back here any minute. We did it, gentlemen.
Goes completely batshit insane when he feeds Angelo Bronte to alligators after an unnecessarily risky revenge mission, murders an old lady in cold blood, doesn't bother to save John when he is sentenced to hang, and even worse, leaves him to die during the final train heist, only to yet again lie directly to Arthur's face. My point is, the narrative made pretty clear that Arthur's main motivation after his TB diagnosis is to save the people he cares about, hoping to find a small piece of redemption in the knowledge that John will be able to live a happy life with his family, free from all this madness. This motivation defines Arthur's character during the last chapters and doesn't change, regardless if you have been playing as low or high honor Arthur. He repeatedly tells John that getting him, Jack and Abigail out of this mess means the world to him.
I feel like you should take your woman and child and get lost.
Do you?
You could give something to Jack. It's that or... Well, I don't see no way out of this.
What about loyalty?
Be loyal to what matters.
What are you gonna do?
I'll be okay, but do it for me. It would make me feel good, if that makes any sense.
A little, but...
Listen to me. When the time comes, you gotta run and don't look back. This is over.
Before the last train heist, Arthur even directly confronts Dutch and insists to let John and his family leave the gang once the job is done.
What do you think?
It sounds wonderful. Hell, yeah. I ain't got much to lose, but... You know, the women and the children. And John and his family. I'm afraid I have to insist. I mean, we gotta let them go, because if the Pinkertons come through again, they will kill everyone.
John? Insist?
Yeah. Insist.
Things we learn
All these scenes are unaffected by Arthur's honor level and the player's previous decisions. Accepting his imminent death and devoting his final days to the rescue of the few people he still cares about is a pivotal moment in the narrative and ultimately defines the character Arthur Morgan as the writers envisioned him. Which makes it all the more baffling why the developers felt the need to include such a nonsensical player decision at the very end. This is where the title Red Dead Redemption comes into play. What exactly is Arthur redeeming in the third ending? He escorts John to a certain point only to betray the entire undertaking and run back for the money, not knowing whether John made it out of there alive. He is on his last legs. What keeps him going for a little while longer is the prospect of getting John and his family to safety. Why would the Arthur who is presented to us abandon a man who is like a brother to him, only to steal a bunch of money he won't be able to use anyway? The tuberculosis is killing him. What is money going to change about that? You are welcome to believe that the selfish ending is the best, but that doesn't make it true on a narrative level. Your feelings are irrelevant. One decision makes sense in light of the overall story and character progression, and one clearly doesn't. People seem to believe that player choice always makes the game inherently better, which is far from the truth. Letting the player influence the narrative is neither negative nor positive. In the end, it all depends on the execution and the context of the story. The way it is implemented here certainly doesn't enrich the story, it weakens it. You don't have to betray the protagonist's character arc or include senseless alternate endings for the sake of player choice. As demonstrated by the rest of the game, a predetermined character can still evoke a sense of player participation by implementing small and subtle decisions along the way.
I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
All aboard!
Before I move on to the gameplay discussion, I think it's necessary to briefly examine if being a prequel to Red Dead Redemption has any benefits or drawbacks in regards to the game's story. We have to acknowledge that a direct sequel to the first Red Dead would have been pointless due to the fact that Marston's death symbolizes the end of the Wild West period. In the video game space, the name Red Dead is almost synonymous with the Western genre. People expect gangs of outlaws, train robberies, and untamed wilderness. Setting Red Dead 2's story before the events of the original was the only option. John Marston isn't the protagonist this time around, but technically the game still qualifies as a prequel. A criticism one could level against Red Dead 2's story is a severe lack of surprises, due to its nature as a prequel. For instance, I find it hard to justify the blatantly obvious reveal that Micah was Milton's rat. He's introduced as a hot-headed, ruthless asshole. Like, of course it was Micah. Knowing about the events in Red Dead 1 makes it fairly easy to predict many of the story's major plot points. We already know that the gang has to fall apart sooner or later, to lead up to the first game's premise. We know that many of the newly introduced gang members won't make it out alive, otherwise John would be tracking them down as well. The demise of Sean, Hosea and Lenny are certainly shocking but also foreseeable. Since Edgar Ross is leading the hunt for Dutch Vanderlyn in Red Dead 1 and Agent Milton has been portrayed as an obsessed bloodhound who wants to bring Dutch to justice at all cost, his death was predictable as well. And then there is Arthur Morgan. While the presentation of Arthur's final stand is fantastic, it's questionable whether his death carries the same impact as Marston's. John's demise as the last member of Dutch's gang and the ultimate embodiment of the outlaw era is a logical conclusion and a point the narrative built towards from the get-go. When it happens, it makes perfect sense, yet it's still unexpected and surprising because it seems to come out of nowhere. Only in hindsight you begin to notice how the writers hinted at this outcome. If you are aware of the events in Red Dead 1, you pretty much enter the game expecting Arthur Morgan to die, since he is never mentioned in the original. At the very least, the final conversation between Dutch and Marston should have included the name Arthur Morgan at some point, but that's a plot contrivance I'm willing to accept in order to justify the existence of Red Dead 2. In and of itself, this isn't a plot hole, but in order for that to make sense, the only logical conclusion is that Arthur Morgan died a long time ago, which is why Edgar Ross isn't looking for him. Arthur was Dutch's right hand. If he were still alive in Red Dead 1, why wouldn't Edgar Ross look for him in particular? Red Dead 1 players are left with the conclusion that Arthur has to die at the end of the game. It doesn't necessarily take away from the emotional resonance of the scene, but it's certainly lacking the element of surprise Marston's death possessed. While it is undeniable that many of the plot points are easy to predict, I wouldn't go as far to say Red Dead 2's narrative suffers as a result. Crafting a story that derives a huge part of its appeal from mind-blowing plot twists and unpredictability can add value to a narrative, but to jump to the conclusion that a narrative has to include plot twists and unpredictable elements to be considered great ignores many of the best stories ever told. Besides, relying on plot twists can just as easily weaken a narrative, if not executed properly. BioShock Infinite's nonsensical ending is a prime example of a plot twist-driven story that crumbles under its own weight. Much like player choice on a gameplay level, a plot twist in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It's all down to the execution. In Red Dead 2's case, knowing the outcome of certain character arcs can be both a curse and a blessing. Of course, I'm arguing from the perspective of someone who has played the first Red Dead. We have to take into account that Arthur Morgan's death, the gang's demise, and many other seemingly obvious plot points might not be quite as obvious to newcomers. But even when you know how the story is going to unfold, it doesn't necessarily weaken the emotional impact. The characters face something they cannot change, which makes the story more about how they cope with the inevitable instead of changing the outcome. A predetermined outcome doesn't mean dramatic tension cannot exist. The epilogue might be a good example of this. We witness John make a genuine effort to sort out his life and become a better husband and father for the sake of his family. He is building his new home, trying to improve his relationship with Jack, and finally proposes to Abigail. Knowing where Marston's path will end adds a bittersweet element and melancholic undertone to the epilogue. It might not be a feeling you want to feel, but to simply say knowing what's about to happen makes these scenes redundant or emotionally empty is far-fetched. Predictability often is the curse of prequels, but in Red Dead 2's case the story still manages to be engaging and filled with dramatic tension. Hopefully, the first part of my critique made clear that there's plenty to admire about Red Dead 2. Despite some minor flaws, I think you actually could make the case that the visuals, world building, story and characters are indicative of a masterpiece. Unfortunately, the gameplay component is where the ingenuity and brilliance of the game ends. Even worse, it takes a step backward compared to many of its open-world contemporaries. So let's have a look at Red Dead 2's greatest weakness: its gameplay. The flaws of Red Dead 2's gameplay are so numerous that I had a hard time determining the most problematic aspects. Forget the fact that you are forced to walk at insultingly slow pace whenever you enter your camp, forget the extensive skinning animations, forget the overstuffed tutorial. The problems I'm talking about reach far deeper and have a far greater impact on the gameplay experience than a list of minor nitpicks. Even die-hard fans of Red Dead 2 seem to admit that the game has some issues. But some issues is one hell of an understatement if you ask me. Not all of the game's gameplay mechanics and systems are outright broken. Instead, they are either incredibly outdated or don't live up to their full potential. That isn't a trifling matter in a game that excels at so many other aspects. A few days after release, a common criticism that popped up online was Red Dead's alleged overemphasis on realism. Much has been said about slow skinning animations and overly sensitive horse collision. The term cowboy simulator was mentioned quite a bit. Most notably, Jim Sterling criticized the game for its obsession with detail to a point where the long animations and overall realism hamper the enjoyment of the game. He draws a comparison between Red Dead 2's tedious animations and the ability to harvest dead animals without even getting off your horse in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. According to Sterling, Red Dead's commitment to realism and detail get in the way of the fun, whereas Odyssey allows you to focus on playing the actual game instead of watching lengthy animations.
Speaking of the horse, it has a maximum whistle range and can't hear you if it's too far away. If it isn't too far away, it comes to you in real time after you call it, wherever it is, because that's realistic, I guess. I mean, it doesn't make the game more convenient, certainly doesn't make it more fun, but Rockstar has placed realism far above convenience or fun.
If we take a look at Red Dead 2's long list of detailed animations and simulated realism, it's not hard to understand why many players agreed with Sterling's criticism. Among other things, you have to feed your horse when it's hungry, brush your horse when it needs to be brushed, clean your dirty guns to maintain accuracy, change your clothing whenever you enter a different climate, restore your health, stamina and dead-eye core by item use or cooking a meal, stay in whistling range of your horse and wait for it, sometimes for half a minute until it finds you. Pay attention to animals' pelt quality, watch a lengthy skinning animation once you killed it, loot each body individually and wait for another animation to play out, take a bath every once in a while, trim your beard, and so on and so forth. I actually feel inclined to agree with Jim Sterling. I prefer to simply walk over bodies to loot their items, since I'll probably get sick of an animation once I have to sit through it for a couple of dozen times. I prefer a horse that spawns out of nowhere for the same reason. In that regard, I place a responsive gameplay experience over realism. The reason why I'm not going to waste much time on the entire cowboy simulator argument is the fact that this particular design decision comes down to personal preference. Sterling argues the way Odyssey handles the realism issue is more fun, while I personally agree this is an inherently subjective criticism. Who constitutes whether Red Dead's high dose of realism is fun or tedious? It depends on the individual player, of course. Other reviewers describe precisely the realism as the most fun aspect.
But Rockstar went out of their way to really make you feel like you have a realistic amount of items on you at any given time. You can't carry around 17 guns with you wherever you go. You can only carry on your person a few guns. So all of your weapons get stored on your horse. There's been so many times I've gotten off my horse to go hunting, I've gotten a mile down the track and then realized I didn't bring my guns with me and I had to go back to my horse. And it kind of sucks, but at the same time it's awesome because I get that feeling of, oh, I left my guns on my horse, let me go back real quick.
Some use the title Cowboy Simulator as a compliment, others as an insult. Not all of Red Dead's realism has a direct effect on actual gameplay mechanics. Tiny details like water slowly filling up muddy footprints, Arthur's clothes getting bloody when you carry an animal carcass, dead bodies decaying over time, or the famous shrinking horse balls. Details like these help to make the surrounding environment even more believable and immerse you deeper into the world without the potential threat of resulting in tedious and annoying gameplay for a certain percentage of players. But in a way, even the game's shrinking horse balls have an effect on the gameplay. And I promise that's the last time I'm using the phrase shrinking horse balls. God damn you, Rockstar. It's difficult to appreciate meticulous animation details when many of the core gameplay mechanics are so outdated and busted. I'd rather have a functional wanting system and less clunky gunplay than hyper-realistic horseball animations. God damn it, I said it again. It just seems like Rockstar didn't set their priorities right. Which leads us to the main reason behind this video. As brilliant as Red Dead 2's world design and story are, the term open world masterpiece is misleading once you dissect the most important part of the game. Any game, for that matter. Gameplay. I boiled my grievances down to 4 major gameplay problems. Number 1, linear and restrictive story missions. 2, dated and unresponsive gunplay. 3, half-baked and broken systems. And ultimately all of this results in a lack of meaningful progression. Let's go through it step by step. One of the first things you are going to notice while making your way through Red Dead 2's extensive story is how repetitive the vast majority of missions are. The procedure is always the same. Talk to your next mission giver, get on your horse and follow the yellow dotted line to your destination. Be prepared for things to go south and be ready for a shootout. Kill all enemies or make your escape. Rinse and repeat. The game tries to break up the repetition every once in a while, but for the most part, that sums up 95% of missions. Repetition is often used as a purely negative term to describe boring and tedious activities in a video game. However, the basic definition simply states a recurring action or event. In fact, repetition is a vital and necessary component of pretty much every video game, regardless if the game in question is brilliant or downright awful. Dark Souls is repetitive as well. You fight your way through the level until you reach the next boss encounter, defeat him or get killed and start all over again. Every game can be boiled down to a basic set of actions. I think what people actually mean when they use the word repetitive is that the game is unable to keep you engaged because you didn't find the gameplay loop enjoyable in the first place, or the game failed to introduce new challenges within its repeating mission structure. And that's precisely the problem in Red Dead 2. The 2 most common gameplay actions during missions, namely riding and shooting, are barely keeping you engaged. Riding to the next mission area can often take 5 minutes and all you can do during this process is mash the X button. Or you can do what most sane people do and activate cinematic mode and let the game play itself. The gunfights never evolve past their initial simplicity for reasons we will discuss in a moment. Rockstar know how pretty the game they created is. That's why the cinematic mode exists in the first place. You are supposed to enjoy the view. The only problem is Red Dead 2 won't be the prettiest open world game on the market forever. Eventually, the stunning graphics will become outdated and the already minimal player input will be even more obvious. Repetition isn't the issue, it's that the things you're repeating aren't riveting to begin with. But the far more important problem comes down to the restrictiveness of the missions. Red Dead Redemption 2 is caught between two very different design philosophies. For the most part, you will spend your time exploring a vast open-world sandbox, allowing you to experiment and improvise, but as soon as you enter a story mission, player freedom ceases to exist. You are bereft of all possibilities and the world around you becomes shallow window dressing. In order to capture the perfect image and achieve the cinematic quality Rockstar is longing for, the game cuts itself in half, bouncing players back and forth between two extremes. The do whatever you want open world part and do exactly what we tell you story part. It's easy to understand why story missions have to be a little more restrictive and guided than the minute-to-minute open-world gameplay. But Red Dead goes a step too far, essentially reducing your ability to problem solve or get creative to zero. I'm not exaggerating when I say the game turns into a rail shooter or your average Call of Duty corridor whenever you trigger the next story mission. What makes the extreme linearity during missions even more ridiculous is the fact that the game sometimes offers you choices to make you believe player freedom exists when in fact it doesn't. To showcase just how absurd Rockstar's restrictive mission design can get, here are a few examples. During one of the first missions, Dutch and Arthur are scouting an O'Driscoll camp to prepare for their attack. Once the gang is in position, the game offers you the choice to either let Dutch make the call or take the lead yourself, only that it isn't a choice at all. You are not allowed to stealth kill a couple of enemies before the fight begins or move to a better position like the water tower you were observing earlier, because even when you make sure you stay undetected, the enemies just trigger automatically.
O'Driscolls! You're dead, you sons of bitches!
Ultimately, your decision boils down to Dutch shoots first or you shoot first. I'm sorry, but that's just silly. Or how about the attack on the Moonshine camp? Go left? Go right? Seriously? Why is that even an option? The game leads you to believe that you got so many different choices during a mission, when in fact you got absolutely none. The so-called choices during Red Dead 2's combat encounters are one of many default player freedoms in most other open-world games. Was I trying to get a strategic advantage on my enemies by flanking them? How silly of me, mission failure. Trying to surprise my opponents from behind and use their own Gatling gun against them? What was I thinking? Mission failure. Trying to find a slightly different path to my objective? Go fuck yourself. Mission failure. The most basic elements of player freedom, like flanking a group of enemies, are actively punished. By now, plenty of mainstream open-world games do a better job in maintaining a certain degree of player freedom during story missions. Even strictly linear-driven games like Uncharted 4 offer more variety in terms of how you're allowed to approach a combat scenario. In most situations, you get to decide whether you want to avoid the fight entirely by sneaking past the enemies, stealth kill most of them, or go in guns blazing. That's already more player freedom than Red Dead's linear mission structure is ever gonna give you. Meaning Red Dead Redemption 2's missions are more linear and restrictive than a game series that's specifically designed to be linear. I don't understand how anyone can defend the complete lack of player agency. You aren't allowed to think for yourself. All the tools and player freedom you have while exploring the open world gets replaced by invisible train tracks. This strong juxtaposition results in a game that is a jack of all trades but a master of none. If you want the best open world sandbox design, play Breath of the Wild or Metal Gear 5. If you want the best of linear driven action adventures, pick up a copy of Uncharted or God of War. Red Dead 2 isn't willing to commit to either side. There is no nice way to say this, so I'll just cut to the chase. For a game that's all about playing a legendary gunslinger in the Wild West, the gunplay is pretty disappointing. There's nothing extraordinary about Red Dead 2's gunplay. Even worse, it seems stuck in a different time period. The words clunky and unresponsive are used quite a lot to describe how it feels to control Arthur Morgan during gunfights. And based on the heated arguments in online forums and sheer amount of how to improve your aiming in Red Dead 2 videos on YouTube, this criticism is clearly widespread. The dissatisfaction with Red Dead's gunplay goes beyond an insignificant minority. The fact that auto-aim is turned on by default also hints at a larger problem. Something is off about the gunplay, and as a consequence, many players' enjoyment of the overall gameplay experience is severely compromised. But what exactly doesn't work here? What makes the controls so clunky? If you aren't a fan of Red Dead's shooting mechanics either, you may be surprised to hear that there's plenty that works just fine. At first glance, the gunplay does everything you would expect from a good shooter. Every gun has realistic reload, recoil and muzzle flash animations, bullets affect the surrounding environment, enemies react to being hit and don't just keep firing unaffected. The damage output is appropriate to the weapon type, and great sound design helps to sell the individuality of each firearm. So if enemy feedback, sound design and gun animations are all on point, why does gunplay still feel so unresponsive? One of the most fundamental conundrums in video game design is the inherent conflict between realistic animations and responsive controls. If you prioritize fluid and realistic animations, you are doing so at the cost of responsiveness. If you prioritize responsiveness and want an avatar that can turn on a dime, you are doing so at the cost of realistic and fluid animations. The further you push to one side, the more you have to sacrifice on the other end. A game like Bloodborne favors responsiveness over animation, which is why you can spin on the same spot like you're on top of a record player. Then there are games that prefer a middle ground like Last of Us or Uncharted, which achieve a pretty good balance between the two. Nathan Drake's animations are detailed and fluid, but you still maintain a good amount of responsiveness. I guess that's where most modern AAA games fall in. Red Dead 2 is the complete opposite of Bloodborne. Whereas your input in Bloodborne has barely any delay, Red Dead 2 places a huge emphasis on super detailed and realistic animations at the sacrifice of responsive controls. And that's what leads to the sluggish and unresponsive game feel people are describing. First of all, it's important to point out that Arthur Morgan's slow and weighty movement is a conscious design choice from Rockstar rather than a mistake. The input delay clearly is a creative choice. It's not like the gunplay is broken, it works exactly as Rockstar intended. Many players, including myself, simply hate this type of design choice. Arthur's 24 animations and the deliberately slow state switch are realistic, but it comes at the expense of not really feeling in control over the character you are playing as. It's more like you are making a suggestion than controlling the actual character. If you compare the input response of Red Dead 2 With other third-person titles, you can see just how much delay the designers decided to apply to Arthur's movement. You can find a detailed analysis of Red Dead's input response on Dan Lowe's channel. I think he is the lead animator at Motive Studios, so he really knows what he's talking about. Anyway, essentially, the developers added a high amount of input delay to Arthur's movement. This is especially obvious when you switch from being stationary to the slow walking animation. Eventually, I came to terms with the delayed movement. What I couldn't get used to, even after a couple of hours of practice, is the extremely slow aim speed. Even when you tweak the settings, moving the crosshair remains a pain in the ass. Unless you are willing to watch tutorial videos online and experiment with the settings for hours on end, there just isn't a way to use free aim reliably. It gets even worse when you are on horseback. You pretty much need auto-aim. Free aim in Red Dead 2 feels challenging, but for all the wrong reasons. Of course, there's a solution to all these problems. Just let the game aim for you and turn on auto-aim like most people playing this game. But if you switch to auto-aim, a new problem begins to emerge. Aiming ceases to be an issue, but now you are missing a sense of skill and challenge during gunfights. Once you turn on auto-aim, every gunfight turns into a cakewalk. All of a sudden, combat encounters are devoid of skill. All you have to do is take cover behind the nearest object and keep spamming the aim button, causing you to seek out targets automatically, shoot, and that's it. Auto-aim also makes it ridiculously simple to pull off headshots at record speed. Whenever you aim, the crosshair automatically points at the torso of your nearest enemy. If you give the left analog stick a slight push, you always land on a direct headshot, killing each target instantly. I mean, not that it matters, once you receive the bolt action rifle, you can one-hit kill enemies even with a shot to the torso. Sniper rifles become pretty much inferior to an ordinary rifle due to the lack of auto-aim. But it gets worse. Auto-aim alone would be enough to make the game's gunfights embarrassingly easy. But when you add a couple of other elements, you literally turn into an almost unkillable god. Maybe intelligent enemy AI could compensate for the overpowered auto-aim abilities. Unfortunately, enemy AI in Red Dead is about as average as it gets. Enemies behaving in a coordinated way, applying techniques to outflank the player, would add a little more depth and challenge to Red Dead's frequent shooting galleries, a challenging element the game desperately needs. But enemies in Red Dead are your ordinary brain-dead cannon fodder, either running right at you like a berserker or hiding behind the nearest piece of cover only to stick out their head every few seconds for a convenient headshot. I'm not saying the enemy AI is significantly worse than in most third-person shooters, but the fact that the AI is average in a game that already offers no challenge or progression whatsoever in terms of combat isn't exactly helpful. In the worst case scenario, the AI is borderline suicidal, showing no self-preservation or strategic effort whatsoever. Still not easy enough, you say? Well, to make absolutely sure that even a toddler could play through Red Dead 2's combat encounters without breaking a sweat, the game equips the player with an almost infinite amount of healing items and Deadeye. Looting bodies after a gunfight is very productive due to the quantity of money, bullets and consumables it yields. In fact, it's too productive. If you engage in one of Red Dead's insultingly easy gunfights, you always leave the fight with a huge net positive. Deadeye is an immensely overpowered ability that is almost unlimited due to item drop from enemies. It also allows you to skip reload animations. I don't know how you could possibly run out of healing and Deadeye items. Take an ordinary story mission as an example. You and Micah are stealing an armored stagecoach only to be ambushed by O'Driscolls. You kill them all without trouble, and after looting 13 bodies you get 2 gin bottles, 10 chewing tobacco, 2 health cures, 3 Kentucky bourbon, 2 bitters, 2 snake oil, and 2 sticks of dynamite. That's not even including ammunition and value items. So I repeat myself, why would you ever run out of Deadeye or healing items? The game's weak spot system you unlock by upgrading your Deadeye ability is a joke. It has to be a joke. As if we didn't know already that shooting someone in the head or in the stomach is more effective than shooting limbs. I wonder what might be an effective way to kill a person. Spoiler alert, it's the head.
You should have gone for the head.
The weak spots on animals only matter if you want to collect perfect pelts, which is another problem we will explore in a bit. In a way, Deadeye reminds me of Fallout's VATS system. Bethesda openly admitted that VATS was created to compensate for mediocre gunplay. Deadeye seems to fulfill the same function here. To sum up, the combat isn't particularly hard to begin with, yet it gets increasingly easier the deeper you get into the game, to a point where skill on the part of the player is totally unnecessary and challenge doesn't exist. It's also hard to appreciate the seamless change from third-person to first-person controls, because the game isn't good at either. Time would have been more wisely spent perfecting one of the two instead. Basically, Red Dead lets you decide between insanely sluggish and frustratingly difficult free aim, or ridiculously easy and overpowered auto-aim, devoid of any challenge and skill. Great prospect. On top of that, we have weak enemy AI, an infinite stock of items and Deadeye, and a laughable weak spot mechanic. Dying in Red Dead Redemption 2 turns into an anomaly. An event so rare, it's easy to forget about its existence sometimes. I can honestly say that 90% of my deaths in Red Dead 2 were the result of Arthur not responding to my commands, or the extremely finicky cover system trying to get me killed. Not only are gunfights ridiculously easy, when you actually die once in a blue moon, it most likely wasn't even your fault. It's also hard to understand why Rockstar's shooting mechanics haven't evolved in ages. As a die-hard fan of Uncharted, it hurts to admit that the third-person shooting never belonged to the top tier of console gunplay. The series is known for generation-defining graphics, fantastic character writing, insane set pieces, and the gunplay never really matched the brilliance of the rest of the experience. But even Uncharted's gunplay evolved over time. It might still not be amazing, but Uncharted 4's gunplay is arguably the most refined and improved version in the series. Naughty Dog added stealth mechanics, a grappling hook, destructible cover, and improved enemy AI for greater flexibility during combat encounters. You can see a clear learning curve. Red Dead Redemption 2's gunplay, on the other hand, feels just as clunky and constrained than all the Rockstar titles before. Before we move on to the game's systems, let me quickly address a couple of excuses I know some of you will post in the comment section. I've seen 3 arguments to justify Red Dead 2's gunplay more than anything else. In regards to the sluggish free aim, you might say, shooting in the Wild West was unprecise and hard, and the gunplay tries to mimic that. That might be the worst excuse for unresponsive gunplay I've ever heard. There are better ways to make gameplay challenging than outright stealing control from the player. Besides, even if shooting in the Wild West was unprecise, you shouldn't implement the same inability to hit targets in a video game. Gameplay mechanics are built on consistency. You are supposed to know reliably when you made a mistake in order to master the mechanics. So, sorry, but shooting was terrible back then isn't good enough. Arthur is supposed to be a skilled gunslinger, so the auto-aim and low difficulty makes sense. If it's more realistic and appropriate for Arthur to auto-aim at targets because he's a gunslinger, please explain why this realism is tossed out the window regarding Arthur's abilities to slow down time and take on entire armies by himself. Rockstar didn't enable auto-aim by default because it's supposed to simulate the accuracy of a gunslinger. They enabled it because free aim is incredibly frustrating for the vast majority of players. And to be perfectly clear, I'm fine with games having low difficulty. Not every game has to have Dark Souls level difficulty. But playing a character that is overpowered from the start and the complete lack of challenge go a step too far. I'd argue a game should make you feel powerful and skilled by mastering the ins and outs of the combat system while still being challenging. Shooting on consoles always sucks. Rockstar did the best they could. This statement isn't even remotely true. There are plenty of far superior first and third person console shooters out there. Halo, Gears of War and more recently MGS5 are prime examples. In fact, pretty much every major AAA shooter is offering more responsive and complex shooting mechanics. Saying shooting is always better on PC is one thing. Obviously, mouse and keyboard offer greater precision, but that doesn't address the problems of Red Dead's gunplay in the slightest. Not all shooters on console are equally as good or bad. That should be self-evident. Is Red Dead 2's gunplay the absolute worst gunplay on the AAA market? Certainly not, but it is unpolished and clunky enough to seriously diminish your enjoyment of the game. Red Dead Redemption 2 introduces quite a number of new gameplay systems. Unlike the gunplay and restrictive mission design, the new gameplay systems promised a lot of potential, which makes the half-baked result all the more disappointing. We can boil it down to 4 major systems. We have 2 already known systems from the first Red Dead, namely a wanted/bounty system and honor system. And 2 completely new additions to the franchise, a camp and horse bonding system. One of these is outright broken, the other 3 are functional but perform below expectations. Surprisingly, the wanted system, despite being a trademark of Rockstar titles for over a decade, actually is the worst system in the game. Much like the gunplay, Rockstar's wanted system seems to be stuck in time. Red Dead 2 features a copy and pasted version that hasn't evolved one bit. The basic idea behind a wanted level makes perfect sense in a Western game. But it isn't of much use when the goddamn system can't distinguish perpetrator from victim and triggers a violent police chase whenever you look at a person the wrong way or let off a fart.
You just bored? You want to make an enemy? You're gonna die. I'll make you to hurt you. Hear about this?
Got a few loose screws.
Bumping into a person on the street at walking speed and shooting an innocent pedestrian in cold blood are treated as the same offense. Riding a horse in town becomes virtually impossible because the slightest contact could lead to an immediate gunfight without the possibility to de-escalate the situation, leading to an undeserved bounty. Saint Denis, the biggest and most densely populated city in the game, has to be traversed like a minefield. Make one false step and the entire police force is on your back. Good luck buying groceries or getting a haircut in Saint Denis without accidentally triggering the end of the world. Apart from the oversensitivity issue, the wanted system doesn't care whether you are dealing the first blow or acting in self-defense, leading to absolutely nonsensical situations.
Shit! It's you. Got the fear yet?
Okay, move yourself along. No fuss town.
There's no way around this. The wanted system is broken. It's not nearly nuanced enough to work properly. The honor meter is a nice reflection of your personal playstyle. While it's not possible to change Arthur's character in major ways, the honor system influences how you are treated by NPCs. A high honor level gets you discounts at stores and new outfits, and a low honor level results in a higher drop rate for dead-eye tonics, throwing weapons, alcohol and tobacco. On paper, that looks like a solid system, but in practice, the rewards are incredibly redundant and underwhelming the longer you play the game. As we've already established, the item drop from enemies is extremely high. Even on a high honor level, the amount of dead-eye tonics, tobacco and alcohol you receive from looting is enough to replenish your entire stock of healing items and dead-eye. I really don't see the need for the benefits of a low honor level when the drop rate is already so plentiful. The benefits of a high honor level are useful during the beginning of the game, but at a certain point the economy flat out breaks apart. Story missions give you more money than you would ever need, and hundreds of fallen enemies are waiting to be looted. High discounts or not, you will have more than enough money. The camp system is a fantastic new idea and only logical in a game that revolves around an outlaw gang on the run. But by now you should have noticed a common theme in regards to the game's systems. They are either broken or never reach their full potential. The camp system belongs to the latter. You get the option to interact with members of the gang and make contributions in order to improve the camp. This could have been a great way to deepen your relationship with certain characters. Unfortunately, your interactions boil down to greet or antagonize. Greeting people rarely leads to insightful conversations, and antagonizing people has no consequences whatsoever, apart from getting knocked out every once in a while. Ultimately, the way you treat your fellow gang members has no influence on the story. The same is true for making donations to the camp. You can be the most obnoxious prick, antagonizing everyone in the camp and never donate food or money, but as soon as the next cutscene starts, the characters behave as if nothing happened. At least upgrading the camp gives you free items, but as discussed earlier, you are never really short of tonics and ammunition anyway. It's yet another wasted opportunity. What makes this even more frustrating is that you can see the enormous potential in selected moments. The 5 campsites are a direct reflection of the gang's steady corruption and downward spiral throughout the narrative. The first 3 camps are placed in beautiful environments and everyone is in high spirits. As Dutch falls deeper and deeper into madness, the campsites become increasingly worse. The last camp is a pitiful sight. Singing and celebration have ceased to exist and you can observe the slow degradation of each character. Karen can't let go of the bottle, and the remaining gang members are either sobbing or constantly yelling at each other. The gameplay systems clearly can support the story in interesting ways, but moments like this are rare, too rare in a 100-hour-long game. I'd argue the horse bonding system is the most developed of the 4 major systems. Building a relationship with your horse leads to detrimental benefits for the rest of the game. Caring for it increases the whistling range, acceleration and speed, as well as health and stamina cores. Additionally, as your horse starts to trust you more, it won't bolt as easily and allow you to do tricks. Horse riding accounts for a significant portion of the game. Finding the best horses to tame and improving your relationship with the animal is a great payoff both gameplay-wise and on a narrative level. Reaching the highest bonding level takes a considerable amount of time, which incentivizes you to keep your horse away from dangerous situations due to the constant fear of losing the animal and starting all over again. The horse bonding system also accounts for one of the most memorable moments. Most probably you will have a favorite horse at the end of the game. Seeing it taken from you in the final chapter actually creates an emotional bond between the player and Arthur. The emotional resonance of this scene is directly tied to the gameplay system.
Push, Arthur!
Thank you.
Arthur!
In a best-case scenario, Red Dead Redemption 2 systems create harmony between gameplay and narrative, an accomplishment that I like to refer to as the holy grail of game design. More and more games put a large emphasis on complex narratives and characters, which makes it increasingly difficult to create gameplay mechanics and systems that establish a meaningful connection between story and gameplay. It should be the goal to merge narrative and gameplay to a point where one enriches the other, instead of actively compromising or weakening the counterpart. Red Dead 2's gameplay systems mostly contradict the narrative aspect of the game or have no impact on the game's narrative whatsoever. Every now and then, exceptional moments hint at what could have been. But by and large, the systems are either broken or never reach their full potential. Red Dead Redemption 2 offers a gorgeous and vast open world filled with activities. It's designed to grab your attention for dozens and probably even hundreds of hours. But in order to achieve such a goal, it's in the game's best interest to provide convincing incentives. The most effective way to keep players engaged is a sense of progression. You need something to work towards, something that doesn't feel like a giant waste of time. Usually, I explore every nook and cranny of a map and finish as many side activities as possible before I continue to focus on the main story. I use the end of a story in open world games as a form of emotional closure. As the story reaches its conclusion, I'm ready to leave the game behind and move on to the next one. I spent well over 100 hours in Witcher 3's world checking every question mark, side quest and monster nest off the list before I dedicated myself to the last third of the story. This playstyle isn't for everyone. Maybe you prefer to beeline the story and explore the intricacies of the world afterwards. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because my playstyle quickly led to major problems and frustration. As soon as the game opened up and I could explore the world at my leisure, I tried to earn as much money as possible to upgrade the camp and buy as many items and weapons as possible. The best way to do so, I thought, must be to invest time in the game's many side activities. So I started to hunt animals, sell stagecoaches, play poker and collect bounties, only to realize that the money I received from 15 hours of hunting and robbing was absolutely pathetic. Very soon I began to constantly ask myself, what's the point? I couldn't find meaningful progression no matter how hard I looked. Now I know why. The game's economy is broken. Basically, you are doing the numerous side activities in Red Dead 2 for two reasons: money or materials. Either you are rewarded with money, allowing you to buy new weapons, outfits, tonics and other items, or you get materials such as animal pelts to upgrade your satchels. But the money you get from most side activities pales in comparison to the amount of money you receive from certain story missions. The ratio between time spent and the payoff is out of balance. Let's say you want to use hunting as a source of income. First, you have to ride to the right location on the map. Once you are there, you have to find the animals you are looking for by following the tracks, which can take 30 seconds or 5 minutes depending on your luck. When you find them, use your binoculars to find a pristine animal, because only pristine animal pelt can be used to upgrade satchels. This can take a couple of minutes as well. Once you've finally found the animal you need, make sure to select the right weapon and kill it. Now that it's dead, wait for the skinning animation to play out, pick up the pelt and store it on your horse. Ride back to the camp or nearest shopkeeper. You get the message. Hunting animals can take quite some time. So you do all of that and finally reach the person you can sell it to, and you get $3.50. Wow.
Wow.
What a way to waste my time. Apart from legendary animal pelts, hunting is a useless way to earn money due to the ridiculously low selling price. Now you may argue, the primary purpose of hunting is to upgrade your satchels and get new outfits. Fair enough. But unless you are the kind of person who likes cosmetic items, upgrading satchels and getting new outfits is almost pointless as well. As I've pointed out already, Arthur is overpowered from the get-go, and combat encounters are insanely easy. So why would you be in desperate need of a bigger tonics or ammunition satchel? In fact, on my first playthrough I completed the game without upgrading one single satchel. Outfits and many camp upgrades will be a motivation for certain players, but the sheer amount of purely cosmetic upgrades in the game represents a huge progression issue for players who don't care about that stuff. Side activities like selling stagecoaches and playing poker are a little more lucrative, but they still feel kinda pointless in light of the immense rewards you get from completing treasure maps and story missions. The amount of animals you would have to kill, stagecoaches you would have to sell, and poker games you would have to win to compensate for the 20 minutes it takes to complete a treasure map is utterly insane. One gold bar can be sold for $500, and many of the early story missions yield similar results. Take the mission American Pastoral Scene as an example. At the end of it, you receive $300, not including the loot from dead enemies. Here is the list of items I was able to retrieve from 13 bodies. 23 revolver cartridges, 59 repeater cartridges, 1 gold plate buckle, 1 silver ring, 1 gold pocket watch, 2 gin bottles, 3 bottles of Kentucky bourbon, 2 bitters, 2 health cures, 1 cigarette package, 10 chewing tobacco, 1 bottle gun oil, 2 bottles snake oil, and $7.81. Are you beginning to understand why the economy could use some tweaking? Chapter 2 is full of lucrative story missions, and the Valentine bank heist in Chapter 3 just kills all motivation to engage with side activities ever again. Around the midpoint of the story, I bought every gun and equipment item, and the camp upgrades were near completion as well. From the 3rd chapter onward, I really didn't know what to do except continue to play the story. You are welcome to enjoy activities like hunting, fishing, and poker. Maybe the activity in and of itself is enough reward for you, but that doesn't change the fact that the economy is severely flawed, and fixing it would have given players like me a much needed incentive. A power curve could be another way to create a sense of progression. Open-world RPGs use skill trees and leveling systems to make your character progressively more powerful. Red Dead 2 has none of that. And that's perfectly fine. Not every game needs a progression system based on RPG elements. There are no skill trees in Mario, Fury, or Celeste, for instance. These games create a sense of progression by introducing new tools and mechanics to the player's repertoire. Each level or enemy usually provide a unique challenge or problem-solving concept, thus testing your ability to combine your movesets in new ways. You stay engaged and feel like you are making progress because the game continues to confront you with new ways to utilize your moveset and abilities. But Red Dead 2 fails at both. A traditional RPG progression doesn't exist, and the gunfights all play out the same, giving you no reason and possibility to develop your skills further. I'm by no means saying that every game needs a complex progression system and power curve to be enjoyed and keep me invested. But a massive open world title like Red Dead should offer some sort of meaningful progression in order to justify hundreds of hours of playtime. Yet I could find none. You are all powerful at the beginning and you are all powerful at the end. Upgrading your satchels feels pointless since you don't need more tonics or ammunition to dominate each gunfight, you already are. If you are not interested in cosmetic items, 80% of achievable upgrades fall on the wayside. Spending time on hunting, fishing, train robbing, selling horses, etc. is useless because finishing just one story mission gives you more money than 15 hours of hunting or fishing ever could. And even if it did promise good payment, what are you gonna spend it on? Satchels you don't need? Firearms making gunfights even easier than they already are? Give me a reason to get lost in your world, other than it looks pretty and the story is great. Masterpiece is one of the most abused terms in the video game industry. The label masterpiece is used too quickly and without much thought put into it. In fact, until recently I've been guilty of doing the same. The currency of the word has been inflated beyond repair. Thanks to the shallow reviews that define much of today's video game media, more and more terms are beginning to lose their value. Red Dead Redemption 2 raises important questions about video game criticism. By now, it has become clear to me that the game received so many perfect scores because most reviewers focused on the brilliant aspects. In their hierarchy of values, a beautifully designed world and phenomenally told story are enough to compensate the gameplay flaws. I have no intention to dictate how other people should review games. All I can do is to share my own requirements and standards. It took me a while to develop something like a consistent value system in regards to games criticism. To be honest, I'm still not quite there yet. But what I can say with absolute certainty is that for a game to be worthy of the title masterpiece, it should maintain a high quality bar across all major aspects. In Red Dead's case, the quality of world building, story and gameplay differ drastically. In a way, it unites Rockstar's best and worst characteristics. The technical fidelity, world design and story and character writing represent the current peak of video games, yet the gameplay portion is nowhere near to those quality standards. I don't expect a game of Red Dead 2's magnitude to be perfect. In fact, you could make a strong case for the claim that something like a perfect video game doesn't exist, apart from maybe Tetris. I'm always willing to look over minor flaws. Otherwise, no game could ever reach the requirements for a 10 out of 10 score. But Red Dead Redemption 2 suffers from more than a couple of minor flaws. The problems are too numerous and severe to be ignored, and justify titles such as Game of the Generation or Best Open World Game Ever Made. Allow me to summarize. The mission design is outdated and restrictive, giving the player no freedom or creative choice whatsoever. The gunplay is not only unresponsive, the auto-aim, mediocre enemy AI and endless stock of healing items and deadeye remove skill and challenge entirely. Most of the gameplay systems are either broken or never reach their full potential, and the game is devoid of meaningful progression. That doesn't exactly scream masterpiece. I'm willing to concede that Red Dead 2 is a masterpiece in certain aspects, but not in its entirety. In order to be worthy of the label masterpiece, I would expect a very high quality bar across all aspects, including gameplay. Of course, we have to adjust the importance of each aspect for each individual game. Many games are all about gameplay and barely feature something you would call a story. Despite Red Dead Redemption 2's many outstanding qualities, I left this game a little disappointed. After criticizing one of the most successful and critically acclaimed games of this generation, I am aware of the fact that some of you might question the intention behind this video. I suspect some of you believe the reason for my extremely critical examination of Red Dead 2 stems from a desire to swim against the tide and present myself as the edgy, fearless critic who opposes the mainstream view. You are welcome to believe that. All I can do is assure you that this isn't the case. I've never cared much about what the mainstream thinks and whether my personal view correlates or diverges from it. I've praised plenty of games that are critically acclaimed by mainstream media such as Bloodborne, Last of Us and more recently God of War, and I've criticized plenty of critical darlings such as BioShock Infinite, Fallout 3 and now Red Dead Redemption 2. I hold certain principles in regards to what constitutes a great game, and I try to abide by those principles. That doesn't mean my principles aren't subject to change. If you want to believe in conspiracy theories or ascribe evil intent where none is present, I'm afraid there's nothing I can do to change your mind, except tell you the truth. Whether you decide to believe me or not is something I cannot influence. It's a natural instinct and perfectly normal to defend the things we like. This even applies for works of entertainment. The more people begin to understand that not every game they personally enjoy has to be validated by the label masterpiece, the more productive game criticism is going to be. For now, I leave Red Dead Redemption 2 deeply impressed and disappointed all at once. Thank you very much for watching.